Hello and welcome everyone to our session today on Let's Code Together. My name is Dr. Samina Qureshi and I'm an International Medical Officer with the MSSO. So I, along with my colleague Nicole Fornerato, are going to be your instructors today. Nicole, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello everyone. My name is Nicole Fornerato and I'm a clinical associate with the MSSO. I am based in northern New Jersey in the New York City metropolitan area. And I'm coming to you today. I like to always give a little weather report, but it's a beautiful fall day here, so it's a really nice day. But I've been with the MSSO now for over 3 years, and before that, I was in the pharma industry in both clinical and PV within various roles within medical coding and beyond. So, Samina, if you want to.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nicole. So in addition to Nicole and myself, we will also be joined by my MSSO colleague, Hannah Eaton, who you heard a few minutes ago. She's going to help facilitate today's webinar. Now, just for you to know, in order to be interactive with us today, we are going to be using the POL-EV software, and the instructions to join POL-EV, as Hannah mentioned, are in the chat section of your GoToMeeting control panel. So it'll let you know how to log on to that, as well as I will go over those later on in the slides. Now, during the presentation, at various points, I'm going to prompt you to log into POL-EV so that you can participate with us as we perform the coding exercises. Now, one other note I'd like to make is that the Q&A portion that we have set aside for today's presentation is intended to answer questions about the various principles that we discussed today around the coding exercises, and it's not really meant or intended to address general coding questions of challenging coding scenarios you may encounter during your daily work. Now, for that, you will also have, towards the end of the presentation, an opportunity to suggest what you'd like to discuss in our upcoming Let's Code Together sessions. What we often do is we take suggestions from the audience on various coding scenarios that they find very challenging, and then we use those in subsequent sessions. Now, we are also going to be using the Medra web-based browser for our coding exercises. And for that purpose, in case you've forgotten your own user ID and password, we have provided you with a temporary training ID and password to use today to perform the exercises, and that you're going to also see in the chat section of the control panel. Now, I know that most of you have signed up and registered for today's session, so you may be aware, but just as a reminder, this session today is going to last 90 minutes. Now, in the unlikelihood that we don't finish all of the exercises that we have listed, we will save them and use them in our next Let's Code Together session in English. Okay, so let's get started. Move on to the next slide. Okay, so some of you, as we know, have varied exposure to our training sessions. Some of you are veterans and may have attended many of our training sessions before. Others might be joining for the very first time. So for everyone's benefit, I'll just give a brief framework or overview on Medra. First and foremost, we should know what the Medra acronym stands for. So Medra stands for Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Activities. And just as a brief background, Medra was developed under the auspices of the ICH. It is an ICH initiative, which stands for the International Council for Harmonization. So the ICH adopted the development of Medra around the mid-1990s. And as you know, Medra is a living, breathing, and ever-evolving terminology. So the ICH appointed the MSSO, for which I work for, as a maintenance organization. And we are tasked with maintaining and further developing the terminology based primarily on user feedback, as well as to provide training such as the one we're doing today, and to administer Medra licenses. Now, all of these Medra MSSO activities are overseen specifically by the ICH's Medra Management Committee, which is composed of various industry and regulatory bodies, with the WHO acting as an observer. Okay, next slide. Now here again, for those veterans out there, they know that we must always go over, we are required to review the disclaimer slide, and so I'll try to summarize it as best as I can. The very first bullet talks about the fact that Medra is owned by the ICH. All of the material presented today is also copyrighted material owned by the ICH. Now, aside from the logos in the presentation, all of the material presented today can be used by you in your organization, but be mindful that if you make any changes or modifications whatsoever, you must make a disclaimer and acknowledge that those changes are in no way supported by the ICH and that they're your own. Okay, the second bullet is basically legal language. The presentation is provided as is without warranty of any kind. In no event shall the ICH or the authors of the original presentation be liable for any claim, damages, or other liability arising from the use of the presentation. And thankfully, the third bullet is not relevant for us today because it talks about third-party material. And we really don't have any third-party material in today's presentation. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here what we basically want to establish at the very outset with a presentation, with the nature of this type of presentation, as you know, there may be some points where you may disagree with the final term selection that we make. So we want to really establish the fact that, you know, sometimes we need to agree to disagree. Okay, now participants are going to be asked to, participate using Poll EV, but if you have a question on the particular example we're talking about, you are free to put that question in the chat section of the control panel. Now, again, as I mentioned before, we can't answer questions on specific other coding scenarios or challenges you may have encountered in your job, only the ones that we are being discussed in the session today. Okay, so after the session, I promise there will be an opportunity to propose new examples in our next Let's Code Together session. Okay, so let's go forward. Now here's the slide, and of course we're going to repeat this slide at various points in the presentation on how to join Poll EV or Poll Everywhere. You need to go either using your tablet, whatever you're using today, your laptop, your tablet, or your phone, to log in using this URL, www.pollev.com/Nicole F, N-I-C-O-L-E-F. Once you go on that URL, you'll be connected to Poll EV. You don't need to enter a username at all. And one other point I'd like to make, don't be shy, don't hesitate to answer the questions because everything is anonymized. We don't know who's answering the questions. Everything is anonymous for us. Okay, so in order to test this Poll EV platform, I'd request everyone to log in now. And for those of you using a phone, here's a QR code. Just open the camera function of your phone, show it this QR, and it'll automatically take you to Poll EV. Okay, so a few seconds for people to do that. You don't need to put a username in, it'll just automatically take you to Poll EV. So let's give everyone a few seconds to join, and we'll pose our very first Poll EV question to you and see if you're successfully logged in or not. Okay, and here's our very first poll question asking us, where do you live? So where in the globe are you located? Just put your little pointers depending on where you're calling in from.
Wow, so it looks like it's working and everybody's lots of responses. This is my favorite poll of the day.
Very good. So I see that we have people from all over. Actually, we have North America, South America, we have Europe, we have portions of Africa even, India. Okay, I think we even have Japan. Interesting. So we have people from all over. Someone's in the ocean still waddling towards land. So
hopefully in a cruise ship, right, somewhere.
Yeah, we have lots of people from all over the world. Well, welcome everyone. It's very refreshing to see that. So just as you logged in here to answer this question, similarly, you'll do the same thing when we have actual coding questions for you to participate in. So very nice to see that everyone is able to log in successfully. Okay, very good. Next slide. Okay, so this is also a very important component for you to know before we start. This is just showing you the various MSSO Medra browsers that you have the various options to log into. Some of you may be accustomed to using the Medra desktop browser. Others, like me, have a preference for the Medra web-based browser, and that's what we're going to be using today to perform our coding exercises. As well, some people may like using the mobile Medra browser from their phone. So nevertheless, if you are using the browser and you've forgotten your own login details like username and password, we do have a temporary training password and user ID in the chat section of the GoToMeeting panel. So you can use that to log in today to help you perform your exercises. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to be using the Medra web-based browser. So let's go to the next page just to talk about. So if you don't want to put in the whole URL to access the browser, one other shortcut is to go to our website, which is www.medra.org. And here's a screenshot of where that will take you. This is the page of our website. And at the very right top corner, where you see where the little red arrow is, you will see the abbreviation WBB, and that will actually take you directly to the web-based browser. That's a link for the web-based browser. Okay, so I'll give you a few seconds if you want to go ahead and log in so you're all set to perform the coding exercises. Here on the screen, you also have the temporary username 89999, as well as the password highlighted in yellow in case you've forgotten your own and you want to use ours today. Okay, so now that everyone knows how to use PollEV, we have here the information for the login. Let's get started. Okay, here we'd want to make a little bit of a before we begin, some points to keep in mind. As you know, when you are coding various case reports and various varied medical verbatims, you know that an exact match isn't always available, right? Otherwise, it would be too easy. Sometimes you have to use your medical judgment. You have to use a sort of a mental decision tree on how to best approach a particular verbatim. And sometimes, like we said at the beginning, there may be more than one approach. I may agree on a particular LLT, and my colleagues like Nicole may want to select another LLT. So for that situation, it's a good idea to refer to the points to consider document. This is a wonderful reference. It gives you various options on how to code, and depending on the nature of your organization's data, as well as your own internal coding conventions, you can either choose the preferred option that the PTC advises, or the other alternate options that it also directs you to. Now, again, I want to emphasize that interpreting data is extremely important, right? You have to use your best estimate, your best medical judgment, and your clinical knowledge. And of course, a very important point to keep in mind, as always with any coding exercises, is don't make any assumptions, right? You should take the information that is given to you in your report. Don't add in additional information that's not there, but by the same token, don't omit any information that is provided to you. So don't add extra information. At the same time, don't omit anything that is given to you. And that will become evident as we perform some of these coding exercises today. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get started again. The QR code we flashed for you in case you're using your iPhone to log in. So let's get started. Let's code together. Okay, the very first exercise. Now here at the top, in the blue box, I have given you a coding verbatim string. The patient complained of abelchia, vomiting, and a metallic taste in mouth after a meal. Okay, so this is what you were provided. Now our thought process should be, is this verbatim clear-cut enough to code? Everything is perfect. You know, I'm trying to look and see what type of information has been reported. And then my thought process takes me, okay, so in Medra, what organ system or what SOC am I going to look for these terms in? And of course, there's several terms in here that need to be coded. So my thought process should immediately start thinking along these lines. And then of course, specifically, I ask myself, what kind of LLTs am I going to pick? And then again, I look, are there any concepts in this reported verbatim that may be combination terms and that I may need to split? Okay, so these are all your mental checklist thoughts that should be going through your mind as you approach a particular verbatim string. So again, I want to read this again. The patient complained of abelchia. Some of you may have heard of that term, others may not. Complained of vomiting and complained of a metallic taste in the mouth after a meal. Okay, so let's go to the next slide after we've seen this and have you use your browser, Medra browsers, and type in POL-EV which LLTs, of course there's more than one, you would select to code this particular verbatim. Let's see what people are thinking. Okay. Vomiting, vomit, good. People are thinking along the right lines. Okay, well there's more than one term. So the patient complained of abelchia, vomiting, and a metallic taste in the mouth after a meal. Okay, taste metallic, good. People are realizing that it's more than one term. So vomiting, taste metallic, good. We're on the right track. Let's see if anyone's coming up. Okay, so someone wrote abelchia. Now make sure that the terms that you put in the POL-EV are actual LLTs in Medra browser. There are actual terms in Medra. Okay. Very good. I think we're all along the right track. Some people are entering things that are not in actual LLTs. So let's go to our own browser and show people how we would approach this. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to go to Dorland's dictionary because I really suppose my medical knowledge or I have never heard of this term, right? So what does abelchia mean? I mean, you know, I kind of have an idea, but I type it into the one that I typically use, a medical dictionary, Dorland's. I type in abelchia, and as you can see, I've done this before this class, I was unable to find a definition in Dorland's medical dictionary per se. So that didn't really help me much. I was unable to find abelchia defined. So the next thing I can do is look at other medical references, as I do in the next slide. Okay, so I looked up in various medical references and I was able to actually come up with an article in the European Archives of Otorhinolaryngology, abelchia, right? And there's an article in there that says abelchia, the very title of that article is inability to belch, burp. So that's what it means, okay? And then they have further retrograde cricopharyngeal dysfunction or RCPD. And just without having to read the whole article, I just want to bring home the message that particular referencing medical literature can provide additional information if you're not familiar with a concept. Okay, so in this case, I found out that abelchia, what it means, and of course, what the scientific term for it is, retrograde cricopharyngeal dysfunction. And if we go on to the next slide, I check additional references. And yes, we do know that that's what it basically means. The additional reference shows me that this particular term, abelchia, is another synonym for retrograde cricopharyngeal dysfunction. And then, of course, it goes on to tell us how to even treat this using Botox. Okay, so for my purposes, I now know the scientific name for this term, and I have a general idea of what it actually means. Okay, the inability to burp. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so let's go in our browser as we will go. And of course, some of you who typed in the POL-EV abelchia, I just want to show you that when I type that in, abelchia, just partial, there is no such term. There is no current existing LLT named abelchia. So that's not there. So the alternate I can do as I'm, researching, I did my medical references. What can I do? So I will go and try and put in the partially of the medical concept that my reference told me, cricopharyngeal retrograde dysfunction, right? So let's see. Okay, so here you go. I actually came up, even though I did a partial word, I come up with the exact scientific term for abeltia, retrograde cricopharyngeal dysfunction. And when I open that up and to see which PT it is under, it's under PT cricopharyngeal dysfunction. So that has actually solved my problem. My medical references have helped me identify the correct medical term for this concept. So I will use the LLT, retrograde cricopharyngeal dysfunction. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and here is this a snapshot of the browser showing you exactly where that particular LLT resides under PT cricopharyngeal dysfunction. So good job. Pat myself on the back that I found the scientific term for that. So let's go to the next slide. And let's review what actually we should have picked. So a lot of you were correct in picking, so this is the new term that we found. The second term that you all did identify correctly was vomiting, perfect, as well as taste metallic. So this would be my final suggestion on how to code and capture all of the concepts in this particular exercise. So we've got abeltia, the scientific name, we captured vomiting, and of course we captured metallic taste. So excellent job. Okay, so let's go on to our second example. Okay, so now I think a lot of you are kind of getting the idea of how to use your mental decision tree in case there's a challenging concept, something that you're not familiar with how it's defined, to use your medical dictionary, to use your references at hand. So here, let's approach example number 2. The patient complained of fatigue and abdominal pain, jaundice, and hepatomegaly. The report diagnosed hepatic infection with Echinococcus multilocularis. Okay, so here, if we're seasoned MEDRA coders, or if we're novices, we just started out, we know that the PTC, or the points to consider term selection MEDRA document, tells us that in case you have signs and symptoms, gold standard signs and symptoms of a diagnosis, the preferred option is you can just code the diagnosis and you don't need to code the signs and symptoms. But the alternate option, which some people may adopt, is you can capture the diagnosis. And here in this report, or this verbatim string, our diagnosis is the report diagnosed hepatic infection with Echinococcus multilocularis. So that's the diagnosis. So if you have the alternative approach you've adopted in your internal MEDRA guidelines, coding guidelines, you can take the signs and symptoms and the diagnosis, or if you have the preferred option, you just take the diagnosis. Okay, so coming back to our decision tree, is everything in here clear to code? What exactly is being reported? As I mentioned before, there's lots of signs and symptoms a patient is experiencing, and then finally the report makes a diagnosis. And then, of course, I think for coding purposes, where exactly am I going to look in my MEDRA dictionary? Which SOC is this sort of generally leading me to? Which organ system is this leading me to? And more specifically, what types of LLTs am I going to pick? And of course, I think about, are there any combination concepts in here? Am I going to do split coding, or are there terms that I can find as one term? So let's go to the next slide and see what you think. Okay, so now before we start looking for exact match LLTs, let's do a little background, because not everyone may be familiar with hepatic echinococcosis, right? So when I open up my World Journal of Gastroenterology, one of the many medical literature sources that I have, I find out that it actually, echinococcus is a zoonotic disease, which means it's passed on from animal to human. And specifically, the infection in the highlighted part, remember our verbatim term said that it was a liver infection, a hepatic infection with Echinococcus multilocularis. And here, in order to save time, I've highlighted specifically that part of the article which is relevant for our coding exercise. Hepatic echinococcus is a life-threatening disease differentiated into alveolar and cystic forms, and is associated with Echinococcus multilocularis, the exact specific verbatim that was in our exercise, as well as with Echinococcus granulosus. So here I have a definition. I have a little bit more insight into the concept. So this is the purpose of using medical literature in order to improve your medical judgment when you pick a code. So let's go to the next slide. Now, actually, I'm going to check my MedDRA term selection points to consider document, open it up to the next section. When I click, okay, and here I'm actually looking at the particular challenge I'm facing about choosing a term that has both the microorganism, in this case Echinococcus, as well as the anatomic location. The Echinococcus was in the liver, right? So I'm trying to see, how do I address that? And here they're telling you your preferred option is to include, if there's a term in MedDRA, to optimally include the microorganism as well as the anatomic location. Now, what do we do if there's no such term which has both? Well, then here, as you can see in the example, section 3.8.2, you try to do two codes then, in case you don't have one term. And in this case here, they have a Klebsiella kidney infection in the example. So if you don't have a combination term, you would choose the kidney infection as well as the microorganism infection. So that would be the preferred option. Okay, so this is just for your background knowledge. Sometimes you have coding challenges, and the best thing to do is to refer to your points to consider a document which will direct you on how to address that challenge. So let's go back to the slides, the next slide, and see how you would choose, what LLTs you would choose. So let's let the audience choose the LLTs based on that verbatim string, now that they have the background information. Okay, so we have people who have done their homework. Excellent. They're very familiar with the browser. Okay. Okay. So Nicole, I think we have very smart attendees. Okay, good. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is actually, a lot of people had the very correct answer. The LLT most specific for this example is having the organism name specifically, as well as the anatomic location. And of course, you know, hepatic and liver are medical synonyms. Therefore, the exact match LLT is Echinococcus multilocularis infection of the liver. And this is just a little pictorial I wanted to show you of an example of this particular zoonotic disease. The active host, of course, is the dog, and through contaminated water, soil, or substances, it's ingested by the human, and of course, it then transfers through the intestine to the human blood circulation and lodging into the liver, giving an Echinococcus multilocularis infection of the liver. So excellent job. This is the correct answer. And of course, as you know, since the other things reported, the patient complained of fatigue, abdominal pain, jaundice, and hepatomegaly, these are all gold standard signs and symptoms of this particular diagnosis of Echinococcus infection of the liver. So good job. Okay, next slide.
Yeah, so Mina, before we move on to example 3, maybe should we stop and see if there are any questions?
Sure. Any questions, Hannah? Or something, if people would want to discuss any aspect?
I see one question at the moment, and it asks, could Abelchia be incorporated as an LLT through a CR?
Absolutely, you can submit that if you feel that the existing synonym term doesn't meet your need. The scientific medical term that we use as an LLT, if that doesn't meet your need, you can give a justification and submit that as a CR. Absolutely.
Yes, and I was stuck in mute, so I couldn't respond to you. But yes, we do have very smart audience, and I just went back to see if we had any additional LLTs that were maybe chosen besides the correct one.
So everyone was smart and so they adopted the preferred option in the PTC document of just capturing the diagnosis and therefore not capturing the signs and symptoms, although the alternate option is to capture both. You could alternatively capture all the signs and symptoms listed, like fatigue, abdominal pain, jaundice, and hepatomegaly, as well as the diagnosis of hepatic infection. Okay. Any other questions? You can put them in the chat panel.
I am not seeing any other questions at the moment.
Okay, so let's go on to our third exercise. And this is a little bit interesting. So here we have the 20-day-old child was born with night blindness and cried strangely. She was cyanotic and generally looked like she was abused. So there's, I want to like really go slowly on this exercise because there's lots of information here for you to focus on. Now, what the points that I would like to make here is that you should remember that every piece of information is important. You should not miss any information provided to you. At the same token, don't add anything and make an assumption of what's there. But here we're giving a specific number. It's a 20-day-old child, right? So that's somewhat of leading you to believe that some sort of demographic term. And then they're telling you that the child was born, that's important distinction, with night blindness and cried strangely. In addition, she was cyanotic and generally looked like she was abused. Okay, so lots of information here. I want to go sort of slowly to make sure people are taking all that into account. We want to making sure that everything that's being reported is accounted for when we pick our specific LLT term. And so, Nicole, what do you think they're trying to say when it says 20-day-old child?
You know, that would be a demographic, right? So I would actually check within the PTC. Is that a good place to start, Samina, for that? Like
Yes,
to go to
absolutely.
the PTC and see, okay, I think this looks like a demographic of a child, a neonate, you know, a baby. So, and start there and see maybe if I can find a definition of where a 20-day-old child belongs. Would that be a good starting point?
Absolutely. And Nicole is really on the right track. So if we could go to the browser, so I can sort of try to perform this before I have people enter their guesses. Let me try and see. Okay, so now she was born, she's a 20-day-old, and she was born with night blindness. So I'm just going to put in, sometimes it's good not to put in exact stuff, just to put in everything that you can get with night blindness. Let's see what we get. So when I type in night blindness in my browser, I get all of these hits, all these LLTs. I get, okay, it's interesting. I get acquired night blindness, I get a plain night blindness, and I get a congenital night blindness. So let me open up each one and see which PTs they go to. So the acquired one goes to PT night blindness, and I further open that up. Okay, it goes to SOC metabolism and SOC eye disorders. Okay, and then I go to the congenital night blindness. Let me open that up. That's different. The PT is congenital. That, of course, goes to my SOC congenital because she's born with it, right? So I would tend to, since I have that distinction between a plain night blindness, which does not link to a congenital SOC, versus a congenital night blindness PT, which does link to congenital SOC, I would go for this one because she's born with it, leading me to believe that it's something she was born with, therefore congenital. Okay, so that sort of resolves my clarity on which night blindness to use. Now, they also said that she was born with night blindness and cried strangely. So I don't know. I mean, cried strangely. What could you possibly get for cried strangely? So again, I'm just going to put up a partial term and see what comes up. And maybe not that partial. Crying. What are the different types of crying? Okay, so I have asymmetric crying faces. I don't think that's exactly what I'm looking for. Then I have uncontrollable crying, which goes to PT, just plain crying, persistent crying, which also goes to PT crying. You have high-pitched crying, inappropriate crying. So if you're new in Medra, it's always a good idea to search to get familiar with the way things are organized, the way they're linked in the Medra hierarchy. For example, in our previous example, we saw congenital link versus a non-congenital link. My verbatim is saying cried strangely. So I would think maybe this one probably is the closest match, crying abnormal. So that kind of looks good to me, I think. Basically, the closest match of what's been reported. So I somewhat have a general idea with that. I may be wrong, but that's the way I'm looking. Then again, they say that she was abused. So I'm going to save that challenging verbatim and see how people approach it without giving them any hints. So let's go to our poll EV slide and see what people are thinking with the hints that I've given them thus far. Okay, so people are on our third example, and let's see what they're thinking. Again, the verbatim is the 20-day-old child was born with night blindness and cried strangely. She was cyanotic and generally looked like she was abused. Okay, excellent. So people did catch on to the neonatal aspect. Good job, Nicole, just like you had thought. So this is a demographic term.
Yes.
Okay.
They're all coming through. Lots of
Excellent. Excellent.
Oh.
Okay. And I don't see anyone accounting for the fact, the last part of this verbatim string, and generally looked like she was abused. How would you approach that? Generally looked like she was abused. We got the crying abnormal neonatal. We got the cyanotic neonatal. What about generally looked like she was abused?
Someone in the
don't
chat has sent in intentional abuse.
Okay, good. I mean, that's, you know, people are going around somewhat. Okay, so let's go to the browser so I can show people a little bit how I would approach this. Okay, so let's start with the choice in the chat. So someone said intentional abuse. Okay, so let's look that up. Abuse. Okay, 114. Okay, so I don't see a term intentional abuse in here. Okay, so we have neonatal complications of substance abuse. I don't think that's quite what they wanted to say. It just said generally looked like she was abused. So she was abused, the child was abused. So it wasn't a drug or particular thing. So we keep looking under our abuse. There's lots of terms, but since let's say I'm new, I want to see what are the various terms. So they have verbal abuse, victim of abuse, victim of child abuse, sexual abuse, spousal abuser. So let me see victim of child abuse. So this person is the victim, right? So she's a child, so someone performed, they think it's a provisional diagnosis. They're guessing that she's generally looked like she was abused. So the correct thing would be victim of child abuse. Now, if we go to this HLT, it's crime victims. Some of you I've seen in past coding, Let's Code Together sessions, mistakenly code things that sound correct, but actually when you look at their hierarchy, they're incorrect. So if we go under the social circumstances SOC, where most of the abuse terms are, legal issues. Okay, so here something very important I want to show you. There are two HLTs under social circumstances SOC under the HLGT of legal issues. There's a category for HLT crime victims, and there's a category for HLT criminal activity. Our scenario, this child is a victim, right? So it would be under the crime victims HLT. So she specifically is a victim of child abuse. Whereas some people mistakenly choose the term child abuse, right? I mean, it doesn't sound wrong, but if you look at the hierarchy in MEDRA, you would realize that by picking child abuse PT, you are mistakenly under the HLT of criminal activity and coding it as if the person was conducting or was the perpetrator of the abuse, right? So the PT child abuse, although it sounds right, means the person abused a child or is a child abuser or the perpetrator of the crime. So the correct HLT would be in the victim's HLT, and of course it would be victim of child abuse. So this is a take-home message, a learning point of when you choose a particular term, make sure just for confirming it's the right category to look at the hierarchy, as in this case, you could make a mistake if you were to choose the word child abuse. Okay, so let's go back to our presentation and see the correct choices. Okay, so in our final selection, I'll tell you, so here are the take-home messages before we do that. Remember the age, the demographic specific terms, like Nicole had mentioned, the 20-day-old led us to choose those terms which were referring to a neonate, because as you know, a neonate is in the first 30 days of life by definition. So all of these terms, some of you just picked a night blindness or whatever. It should have been congenital night blindness, as well as the cyanotic was neonatal cyanosis. Okay. And of course, we just gave you that point, victim of and perpetrator of various types of abuse. So let's see the final results. The correct LLTs were congenital, night blindness, crying abnormal but neonatal, and the victim of child abuse. And I know this sounds very sad, and I don't want to end the exercises on a sad note, so I just want to reveal that after further analysis and exploration of this case, next slide, it turned out that provisional diagnosis was incorrect. The abuse did not occur, and you actually have a very happy baby. Okay, so that is it for my three examples. So Nicole, would you like to perform the next example?
Sure. Should we see if there are any questions on your last example first?
It looks like there was some questions about the possible child abuse. Wouldn't you ask for further information since the description is a bit vague related to the abuse?
Okay, so if we go back one slide, the verbatim term as reported was she was cyanotic and generally looked like she was abused. So this is very clear that she's the victim, right? And obviously, by common sense, a neonate can't perform child abuse, right? They're too little. So they can just be the victim. So in this case, it was very clear that she was the victim of child abuse and not a perpetrator, and therefore the PT child abuse would be incorrect. Yeah. Now, had this been an example of an adult, yes, that's where you could have, had both thoughts. But the way it's written, the sentence, it's quite clear that she was a victim because she was abused, the recipient of the abuse.
So Samina, in this case, maybe I think I could see where a question would come from because it says generally look like she was abused. It doesn't necessarily say she.
It was happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe would there be an alternative? So if someone feels a little uncomfortable, maybe they can send a query or something.
So actually, and this is a good point the person brings up in their question. The take-home message and the reason we have this, in a gray area is because sometimes when you have a provisional diagnosis, right? Like for example, in another exercise, you could say, we thought she had a strep infection because she complained, it was suspected that the patient had a strep infection and they had these signs and symptoms. So when you think or you are not quite sure of a particular confirmed diagnosis, that's a provisional diagnosis. So in this case, either you could query if you wanted, there's two options. You could query like the person in the question asked because you're not clear, or you could treat this as a provisional diagnosis until further clarification. Any other questions around this example?
Perfect. I think it was, all just that of looking for possible child abuse was kind of the general sentiment.
Okay. I approach this as a provisional diagnosis.
And in MEDRA, right, I don't think we don't have any provisional abuse terms like potential victim of abuse or something like that, right? I don't believe. No.
That's a good question. Let's look.
We can check so that everyone can see, just in this case, why is the browser acting funny?
So let's see, around abusive, we have potential or suspected.
Yeah, now, maybe we could just show them and see if we have any.
So in abuse, we can say suspected and see. Absolute good idea to venture around and see what is actually in MEDRA of the choices. Okay, so there's no suspected. So let's say potential. Oops, I need a space there. Okay, potential. Okay, so as of now, I don't see with this particular search that we have suspected, or you won't have the word provisional, but you could have suspected or potential abuse. Here you either have victim or child abuse, victim of abuse or child abuse. Okay. And then of course you have other types of abuse. You have elder abuse, which is for senior citizens, which is against demographic specific. And here, as you can see, victims of abuse, victim of elder abuse, victim of sexual abuse. So you have a victim of, and you have perpetrators of that particular crime.
Yep, so that sparked good discussion, right? Because you can see, and then you have an alternative, you know, to say, okay, maybe you could code the potential, or just code it in general, or send a query, to see a final decision. So that was great. All right, so are there any other questions? If not, we'll move on to example 4.
Nope, no more questions.
All right, good. Oh, there's a little smiley. Sorry, I forgot that. All right, so now let's take a look at example 4. So the first example I'm going to present today is the patient had a history of tunnel vision and tends to focus all of their energy on one activity. So now let's ask ourselves, is the verbatim clear? Right? It seems to be to me upon first look at it, right? Then we say, like, what exactly is being reported here? Does this term need to be split? So standard questions that we always mention during these sessions to help remind ourselves to get into the right mindset for coding, right? Same thing Samina went through with her 3 examples. So in this case, what I'm gonna do is actually have everyone try to come up with some responses before we actually go through anything. So I'd like to open up the next poll. Just bear with me 1 second. I just got to activate this so everyone has a chance, and we'll see. Oops, sorry for the typo in there. We'll see. That's supposed to say what LLT or LLTs would you select. So let's see what people start selecting here. And then I'll take you through the process of what I would do to kind of go through this term. So it looks like lots of LLT tunnel vision. Seems to be, you know, makes sense, right? Give a few more minutes, give everybody an opportunity to kind of chime in with what LLTs they think would work here. Wow, it looks like unanimous right now. This hardly ever happens where everyone gets the same choice. All right, give a couple. Okay, well, this is still going. What I'm going to do now is walk you through. Oh, we got one other response here. We're starting to see different responses, so I'll let this keep going maybe a little more. I would query, since it sounds like it should be in medical history rather than an adverse event. Okay, well, we don't know exactly where it's turning up, but okay, that's a good point. All right, lots and lots and lots of tunnel vision. Okay. Give another couple seconds because I feel like there was still, oh, energy increase. That's interesting. That's an interesting response. All right. See that take on it. Okay, lots of unanimous agreement here, even from everyone all over the world. Okay, so let's take a look now. What I'll do is I'll let this keep running kind of in the background, and I'm going to walk you through how I would approach this. So the first thing I would do when receiving a term like this is I would go to the browser, right? I'm sure that's what everyone did that's on the line. So I'll pull up the browser. My browser is going to look slightly different than the one Samina used because I'm using the desktop browser just to give you a little feel for what that looks like. And the first thing I would do is say, okay, I know the verbatim term. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to just pull up tunnel. I want to see if we have anything related. As everyone showed, in the poll, you can see we do have a direct match of tunnel vision. So if we open this up and expand it, we can see that this actually goes into a primary SOC of nervous system disorders with a secondary SOC of eye disorders. So there, we can see there is a direct match available in MedDRA. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave my browser, pull it away for a second, and I'm actually, after the next thing I would do after browsing is I would reference the reported term, right? So here we can see this screenshot is from the Cleveland Clinic website. So while searching for the term tunnel vision, this is what it pulled up. So as you could see from the screenshot, tunnel vision in medical terms is equivalent to peripheral vision loss, meaning your vision is limited to objects that appear directly in front of you and anything else is difficult or impossible to see. This condition can be temporary or it can be permanent depending on what caused it, right? So now we have a little background information on tunnel vision. So I'm saying to myself, okay, I saw what the verbatim term contained, right? And it was, they had tunnel vision and they were really, you know, hyper-focused on one kind of object or one activity. So next what I would do is I would continue my search for tunnel vision. And when I continued that search, I came across this reference from ADHD Online. So as you can see in this screenshot provided, a reference to tunnel vision is made. It's referencing hyperfocus, which I kind of said when I was just describing it as tunnel vision. So in this case, tunnel vision or hyperfocus is when a person is so engrossed in a task that they can't take their attention off of it and everything else gets blocked out. So it typically happens when a person is involved in an activity, say an activity that they really truly enjoy, and it can be good in a sense of productive hyperfocus, or it can also be negative because sometimes when a person gets interrupted from something like this, they may get irritated or grumpy. I feel like maybe we all may have been there at one point or another where you get so into something, maybe you're in a zone at work or you're running a marathon or you're doing something like that where you just get so into what you're doing that you're like totally hyper focused on that and the whole world seems to disappear at that time, right? It's just like you and whatever you're doing. So that's kind of what this is, and that's why it can be a positive or a negative, but at least now we have another idea and something else coming up for maybe what tunnel vision can stand for, right? So in this sense, tunnel vision is a non-medical or slang terminology for the actual medical concept of hyperfocus. So now it gets a little interesting because we have another point of view on maybe what tunnel vision can be. So what I would like to do is have everyone kind of, we'll go back to our little poll. Just bear with me again, I'm sorry, because I have to just pull this up and activate it. But we can see here, is there now, thinking of what we did, and we went through, you know, the browser, and then we went through some referencing, would anybody change their initial response for what you would do? Remember, use your browser and go in and see, would you still keep it tunnel vision, or do you think maybe you would change it? And let me remind everyone, the original verbatim is, the original reported term is, the patient has a history of tunnel vision and tends to focus all of their energy on one activity. So let's see. So as we go through this, now I'm seeing a unanimous vote for an LLT in a different sense. So now I'm seeing lots and lots of hyperfocus being chosen. So let's see here, what else would come up? I wouldn't change it, code as reported. Okay, so one person would say, tunnel vision is wrong. I would change it to hyperfocus. Okay, very good. I like the little extra explanation behind it too. And remember, you can put whatever you want in this. It's totally anonymous and it disappears after this. So, all right. So now we have lots and lots going in a different direction. Okay, so still some tunnel vision. So taking you through, continuing on with the process of what I would do next. So now that we have, okay, we got quite a few votes so far. I'll leave this open. I'll just take it off the screen for now. And then continuing on in the process of what I would do if this was me and I received this term, I'm going to pull back over the browser. I would go back in, and now that I've referenced, I said, okay, you know, tunnel vision, there's nothing in the verbatim that seems to, lead me in this direction, right, of the exact match that's available in MedDRA. I did see, however, some referencing on hyperfocus. And I see that everybody saw this, not everybody, but a lot of people saw the same thing. So I went in and I would you can either search for focus itself, or you can pull up the actual term of hyperfocus, it will come up. And what we'll do here is we'll just expand the term and see. So it links to the PT, change in sustained attention, right? And it goes into the primary SOC of psychiatric disorders. So with that being said, and now that we do see MedDRA does contain a term to capture, say, the alternate meaning of tunnel vision, what I would suggest as a final suggestion, so with all that being said, and considering the entire term that was reported, right, they tend to focus all of their energy on one activity and they have tunnel vision. The LLT of hyperfocus, I would say, would be the best match. So good job, everyone who chose that. So I would like to mention, I did see some responses coming through that I would keep it tunnel vision, and you can say, okay, we have an exact match in MedDRA for tunnel vision. Why isn't that being chosen? In this case, it's just always important to remember the whole term that's being reported, not just one piece. So yes, it did say the patient has a history of tunnel vision, but then it gives all that additional information. It tends to focus all of their energy on one activity, etc. And in this case, you have to consider everything and put it all together after you do your referencing and after you search the browser. So in some cases, an organization may opt to query this term to ensure it is indeed referring to hyperfocus, depending on what therapeutic areas your company focuses on. Maybe you do want to send a query, and that would be an organization-specific decision that would have to be made. So always be sure to check with your organization's internal coding conventions, right? Because I would say I'm okay, I feel comfortable coding this to the LLT hyperfocus. Some people, as we saw in some of the responses we received, may not feel so comfortable. They may say, okay, with the exact match. And then you can always send a query just to ensure what's going on. So just some learning points. This slide serves as a general reminder around some learning points. So always remember when coding or analyzing terms that sometimes non-medical or slang terminology may be reported. And because of this, referencing a specific term is key. So especially if working internationally, where a translation for a slang term may not be available, or may not even exist, right? Or may never have been used. Maybe this is an English specific thing. Maybe this is something, that's just never even heard of in a certain country or a certain region of the world. So it's always best, to make sure you do your referencing and look up everything, because there are some slang terms that are used in certain areas of the world, maybe different than other areas, etc. So my other tip would be always check the MedDRA browser just like we did. We go in, you do your first search, look up tunnel, then kind of go through the referencing stages, and then maybe go back to your browser and see if there's anything else available. And the last thing I would like to add, I always put this as a good reference point, is to use your colleagues as a resource, right? Lots of us work very internationally. We're very fortunate that we get to work with a very international audience. So use your colleagues as a resource. It may be beneficial, especially when dealing with a term that's tricky, or a term that uses, in some cases like this, maybe a slang terminology for that was reported, and it's just how it's reported, it comes in. So with that being said, Hannah, are there any questions around this?
Yes, we've got some requests for clarification on the tunnel vision. In addition to hyperfocus tunnel vision, could it continue as an LLT as it's part of the patient's medical history? Or do we not consider tunnel vision because it's not a current issue and is just medical history?
Well, when you receive a reported term, it doesn't always have to be an adverse event, right? So in this case, they have a history of tunnel vision and they tend to focus all of their energy on one activity. So it's really the whole term, the term as a whole, that we need to consider as it was reported. And, giving the background does, provide some input. And in that case, when you consider this as a whole, and since it was all reported together, then it kind of comes together. And you can, that's why I say I am very comfortable putting this to hyperfocus instead of the actual peripheral vision loss kind of tunnel vision term that's a direct match in MedDRA. Okay, any other questions?
Perfect. I am not seeing any other questions. We just got that this is very helpful. So good.
Oh, good. That's great. That's good to hear. And, you know, I like to keep it so, you know, a lot of times because slang terminology and non-medical concepts are actually used and they do come in as reported terms. So it's nice to see. And you know, sometimes MedDRA does keep the, you know, the actual medical concept, which in this case would be tunnel vision, but it's good to kind of open and take that, you know, kind of physician hat off or whatever role you may be in and kind of look from a broader perspective and use the whole term to kind of code. And years of, you know, being in the medical coding industry has you know, got me to that point where that's why when I see a term, I don't just take it at first glance. You know, I kind of dive a little deeper into it all the time. So thank you for the feedback there. Okay, so now we're going to move on to example 5. So this example is the patient has a history of asthma and wakes up with a dull, throbbing pain in head every night at the same hour. She took an NSAID, and upon taking the NSAID, she had an asthma attack. Her inhaler failed to work. So as usual, when looking into a reported term, I would ask myself the similar questions, the questions we went through this whole training so far. So in this case, the reported term or narrative report is very large and contains a lot of information. So in this case, the first thing I would say, what I would do first is let's take a closer look at the term, right? And what I'll do first, I want to pull up a little poll question. And I just want to see what everyone's thinking is. Just bear with me, sorry. I am going to activate this. So I would like to know, do people think there are a total of 5 concepts to report it and code it within the term? True is yes, and false would be related to no. We'll see what people think. So again, the patient has a history of asthma, wakes up with a dull, throbbing pain in head every night at the same hour. She took an NSAID, and upon taking the NSAID, she had an asthma attack, and then her inhaler failed to work. So what do you think, 5 concepts or 4? So it looks like lots of people are saying they do not believe there are 5 concepts to be reported and coded, right? That is winning right now. Okay, so let's go through what we'll think. We'll take a closer look. All right, so with that being said, I would first start by breaking down the term. This is my process of how I actually would handle a term like this that comes in. So I would break it down. So into what needs to be reported, right? First, I'll get that piece, and then I move on to what needs to be coded. So let's start with the first piece to be reported. So the patient has a history of asthma. So yes, in this case, again, has a history of asthma. So I would say that would be, you know, might be a medical history term, but it's still something that could be reported and coded. So in addition, the patient also wakes up with a dull, throbbing pain in head every night at the same hour. Okay, so that's another piece of information. I would say that's a very important piece of information, something we would want to make sure gets reported and eventually it gets coded. Then the next piece, I would say, she took an NSAID, okay, and upon taking the NSAID, she had an asthma attack. So maybe she took an NSAID, okay, that's a medication term that may be better, you know, held for a dictionary like WHO drug, but then it's giving you very important information here. Upon taking that NSAID, she had an asthma attack. So that's the next piece. And then finally, her inhaler failed to work, right? So it's a lot of information. So that's why I always take the first step of breaking it down into viable items that need to be reported. And then we can move on to tackling the coding piece, right? So with going through all of that, there are a total of 4 concepts to be reported and coded within this term. So now, with that being said, let's move on to the coding piece. So what LLTs would you select for these concepts? So now I'm going to give you a chance to see what you think should be selected. Let me just activate this poll and we'll see what people think. So for each concept that we went through, so the patient has a history of asthma. They wake up with a dull, throbbing pain in her head every night at the same hour. Upon taking the NSAID, the patient had an asthma attack, and then her inhaler failed to work. So you can put them all, you can put 4 LLTs on the same line, just, you know, let me know what LLT, with a little LLT in front, or you can give them individually, whatever you feel most comfortable, but I'll give people, you know, a little bit of time here because this is quite a large term and it has a lot of information. So we'll see what people come up with. Drug-induced asthma, a throbbing headache, asthma attack induced. Okay, getting lots of variety here. So unlike my first example, this one's getting lots and lots of different suggestions provided. Asthma attack, NSAID exacerbated. Respiratory diseases, all right. Device failure defect, okay. Nocturnal headache. Very good. They're looking for a term for product failure. Okay. Lots of different suggestions. Aspirin, asthma, okay. Nictal. Oh, that's interesting. So someone would capture 2 different headache terms for the headache piece and drug ineffective. Okay. I'm going to give just a couple, like another minute or so we can make sure we get to our final example as well and get the answers for this. Very happy to see all these responses, though. This is great. Throbbing headache, asthma attack. Okay. And again, instead of what I should have mentioned as well, because I did mention something about medical history, but in this case, we don't want to necessarily focus so much on what can be a medical history term versus what can be an adverse event versus indication or whatever the case may be. We just want to focus on the term and what's inside the term that may need to be coded, reported, and then need to be coded. And of course, you know, you understand this is probably, you know, coming in the post-marketing environment, such a term like this. Whereas if this was in the clinical environment, this would be something that would need to be broken down and split at the site itself, you know, by a query to the investigator. Whereas in post-marketing, this is something that maybe could be split on that side and then coded individually. And it's important to go through these because when you do get such a term, you want to make sure whoever is doing that splitting of the narrative or pulling information from source docs is actually pulling everything that should be reported and coded as well. Sometimes it's the medical coding group, sometimes it's a whole different group, maybe a case processor, it may be somebody else. So it's important to just see and go through all the different aspects of, you know, a term. All right, so I think, you know, we had a little bit of time here with this. So what I'll do is I will move on to the responses. So now let's see what the final, the correct responses and my final suggestions are. So the patient has a history of asthma. So easy enough, code that to the LLT asthma, right? So number 2 was the patient wakes up with a dull, throbbing pain in head every night at the same hour. And here I did not see this coming through as a response, but I would suggest coding this to alarm clock headache. So as you can see, there is no reference included for this. I would suggest what I did in my process around this is a quick Google search, and I searched for a dull, throbbing pain in head every night at the same hour, right? And it revealed that this can be an alarm clock headache. Or using a medical dictionary, right? You can search for alarm clock headache, or its proper medical term of hypnic headache, right? So if you do a quick search on the web, whatever browser you may use, and you're just kind of getting a feel, and then you go to an actual medical dictionary and say, okay, this alarm clock headache, is this a thing? And you see that it has an actual medical terminology of hip neck headache, right? So then I would say, okay, I would next, after doing my search, I would go in the browser and I would say, okay, what is this? Like, there's a dull throbbing pain. It happens every night and it's at the same hour. That's the most important piece of information, right? Every night it happens at the same hour. So in this case, I would say, okay, is there something to this alarm clock headache thing? And I would go in the browser after doing my referencing and I would come in and say, all right, there it is. So in this case, I selected the LLT alarm clock headache. However, you can see here that the actual medical terminology for this term of hip neck headache, right, is available. So that could also be an LLT that you choose to select instead of alarm clock headache. And if you do, again, if you do a nice little reference search on what this stands for, it will show you that it is, we can do it right now if we want. Just bear with me one second. I'll pull up, I could come over here and just go in Google real quick or whatever browser you may use and pull up the terminology. And again, you feel free, you can use your actual medical terminologies. So as you can see, it's a headache that does appear every night. And here it's saying we can actually do alarm clock headache as well. But this is how I would go through my process. So, right, it's a nickname for a rare headache syndrome called hip neck, and it's a dull or throbbing headache that wakes people up at the same time each night. So there you go. And that's how I started the search, doing some referencing and then going in the browser and checking it out. So let's go back to the presentation here, and we'll keep continuing on with the terms. So upon taking an NSAID, the patient had an asthma attack. So this is very important because you do have two pieces of information here that are combined as one. So they took an NSAID and then they had an asthma attack. So what I would do in this case as well is go in the browser and I would say, hey, is there anything available for, say, an NSAID, right? And as you pull it up, you could see there is an allergy. And then here, very interesting, there's an NSAID exacerbated respiratory disease, which is the LLT I chose. And if I right click on this and I go to the browser, I can see here that it falls under the same PT, but it is related to an asthma, aspirin sensitive, or asthma exacerbated respiratory disease. They all fall under the PT. So I chose the NSAID exacerbated respiratory disease because that encompasses asthma, and then it also encompasses the fact that the patient took an NSAID. And then finally, we pull up her inhaler failed to work. And in this case, an inhaler is a device and the device failed to work. So I went with the LLT device failure. And that's how I would handle that term. So you see, when it was a lot of information at first, and then kind of the best way to tackle something like that is break it down, right? And then as you're breaking it down, use that information to kind of guide your search along with your, your medical references and your browser to help you find appropriate LLTs. Okay, Hannah, so with that, are there any questions around this?
We just have one at the moment asking, can we assume that the patient has an alarm clock headache, although the diagnosis is not provided in the verbatim?
So with this, since we have the information that they wake up with a dull throbbing pain in head every night at the same hour, I would say I'm comfortable putting that to alarm clock headache. Again, that's why Samina goes through at the beginning, and she went through in a couple of her examples as well. If you really, you feel like you need to query this, then I would say definitely send a query. Just confirm that this is an alarm clock headache if you don't feel comfortable putting it to it. But after, if you go through and you do your referencing and you search the browser and you say, okay, this is available, I would feel comfortable putting it to the LLT alarm clock headache. And if you don't, that's okay too. Send a query and try to get a confirmed diagnosis of a hip neck or an alarm clock headache or something to the extent. But because it said every night at the same hour, I'm comfortable. Are there any other questions?
It looks like that is the only question at the moment.
Okay, great. All right, so with that being said, we're going to move on to our last example for today. 6 went by so fast, right? Always does. Okay, so now on to example 6. The patient took medication to prevent malaria and experienced abnormal thoughts and visual hallucinations. He started to cut himself and felt down. He abruptly stopped the medication and he returned to a normal state. So as you can see, yet again, this example is packed with information and potential concepts that will need to be reported and coded. So again, the first thing I like to do to make myself feel more comfortable and to just get a grip on all the information when it's overwhelming and you're like, maybe your head starts to spin. It's like, it's just a lot. You want to make sure you capture everything, you code everything. So I just take a closer look at the term, right? And again, I'll break down the term. My first thing I'll do. So first I will say, okay, the patient took medication to prevent malaria. Okay, look at that. Then they experienced abnormal thoughts. We have that information right here. They also experienced visual hallucinations. Okay, then with that being said, he started to cut himself and felt down. And then finally, he abruptly stopped the medication. State, I mean, that's there. I don't know if we have to do anything with that from a coding perspective, but I would definitely say now we have this kind of more in bucket it where we can say, okay, we can see what needs to be reported. Let's see how we would code this. So I'm going to give everyone an opportunity now to go through and let me just activate this and see what you would think. You can provide LLTs for all of these different broken down terms, and let's see what people come up with. Okay, very quick responses. This is nice. We have everybody in their browser. Hopefully fully engaged. Oh, I have another typo. I'm sorry. I'm human. Sometimes I make a typo, and I should have saw that, but with experiences here, I spelled it wrong. I apologize. All right, malaria prophylaxis. Prevention of malaria, okay. And remember, make sure you use your browser to see if you get an actual LLT term, the terms that we do have available in Medra. Feeling down, visual hallucinations, okay, we're getting into pieces, self-harm. Lots of information here. Jam-packed, malaria immunization. That's an interesting one. Okay, prevention of malaria, abnormal thoughts. Visual hallucinations, fainting. Oh, okay. Someone's reading that he felt down, maybe as he fell down, but we'll see. We'll keep going. We'll give a little more time so everyone has an ample opportunity to provide their suggestions. Wow, this is great. So many quick LLTs coming up. Fell down, drug withdrawn. Cerebral malaria, interesting. Malaria prophylaxis. Stop medication. Okay, drug withdrawn. And obviously, when you receive a reported term like this may be something, that gets flagged and maybe looked into further within your organization as well. As this kind of is a big one with tons of information. Okay, I'll give a little more time for everyone. Self-inflicted laceration. Deliberate self-harm. Okay, great. All right, so at this point, what I'll do is prevention of malaria, sensory hallucinations. Okay, so what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna go through what the responses are. So this is just, and I should have had these come in, but at this case, what the final suggestions to these. So for the first one, since malaria is a parasitic infection and a medication was used to prevent malaria, I would code this to parasitic infection. Let me pull over the browser here and let's take a look. So how I would tackle this one is I would first start, I guess you can start with malaria and see here. There is actually malaria prophylaxis, so we can go to that. I put parasitic infection prophylaxis, but however, a closer match would be the prevention of malaria or the malaria prophylaxis in there. So what I did was I went in and when you're looking for, say, a prophylaxis type term, since we know it's malaria, you can type in the malaria, but from here, you can also do a kind of shortened piece of the term. So for prophylaxis, you would want to pull up something like this where you can get both prophylactic and prophylaxis. Just a little tidbit for moving forward. However, in here, I would say, since we do have a malaria prevention or a malaria prophylaxis, that everyone putting in the poll is correct when they did put that, because I would change this LLT from parasitic infection, although malaria is a parasitic infection, to we have a more specific malaria prophylaxis or prevention of malaria. So good job, everyone there. And then the experiencing abnormal thoughts, I would go to the LLT of abnormal thinking, right? Because thoughts and thinking, around the same. And then we have experienced visual hallucinations. So this would go to visual hallucinations, kind of straightforward. And then we have a trickier one. He started to cut himself. And I did see that this was, I believe this was reported as a term, the self-inflicted laceration, right? So in this one, if I go to the browser again, and I open it up, the first thing I would do is I would search for a term like cutting. Is there anything available? It looks like here it's all cutting of medicated plaster, transdermal patch, etc. So I would say, okay, there's nothing really in there. And then I would say, what's a synonym? It's always important to kind of search the synonyms of a term that may come in, right? So we have cutting. So then I would go to laceration. And I would just say, okay, lots of terms popped up. And I would scroll down, just scroll through and say, is there anything that maybe matches what was reported? So I would come down and say, all right, well, here's an interesting one, the self-inflicted laceration. If you want to get a better look at it, you can right click on it. You can go to the browser. You could see here the primary SOC would be the psychiatric disorder SOC. You would double click on it and you could see, okay, I think that's a good match. He started cutting himself, self-inflicted laceration, right? Laceration and cutting are synonyms. And then we have he felt down. And I saw lots of responses here for falling down. However, this says he felt down. So this is like feeling down. So in this case, the LLT of feeling down would be more appropriate. However, if you feel like this maybe was meant to read he fell down or, whatever the case may be, you can always query it. But in this case, since he felt it, he was feeling down as the LLT. Okay, and then finally, he abruptly stopped the medication. So in this case, I would come here and again, you can search maybe stop medication, whatever you feel you would like to, see if you see anything. Then I would say, okay, what's a synonym for stop? And I would say, okay, cessation, right? Stopping of something. And then here I would see there is a therapy cessation. And then in this case, we saw in the term, it states that he abruptly stopped the medication, not a healthcare provider. So we do have that the patient actually stopped. So I would say therapy cessation by patient. And then if you want, you can go to the browser and just take a look. And you can see they all fall under the same PT, but in this case, it was stopped by the patient. So that is why on the bottom there, I have my LLT of therapy cessation by patient. So those are my final suggestions. And I'd just like to, again, say for this top one, good job, everyone, because you saw that there is a malaria prophylaxis. So we would use that. And with that being said, those are my final suggestions. And this is our final example. So Hannah, I just want to check in and see, are there any additional questions or questions around this term?
Yes, we've got a couple questions that have come in. The first
Okay.
one asked, isn't malaria prophylaxic more specific?
Yes, yes. So ignore my LLT here because I went to parasitic infection prophylaxis, but this should state in the LLT malaria prophylaxis. Yes. So that will be updated before the slide goes out. So, and this is why we do these things. See, so in there, everyone knew it malaria prevention, malaria prophylaxis, and that is exactly what it should be.
Perfect. Our next question says, my understanding of the symptoms were that they arose after taking the malaria medication. Would these be considered drug-induced symptoms rather than being
Yes, so
coded separately?
that's a good point, and I did see that come up in our choices here. Now, it does not say, so here it says patient took medication to prevent malaria. They experienced certain things. Yes, you could say, okay, they took the medication, they started experiencing things, they stopped the medication, they returned to a normal state. However, it does not directly say that the abnormal thoughts, the visual hallucinations, the cutting himself, the feeling down were directly related to the medication, right? So in that case, if you want to see if it was drug induced, I would suggest sending a query to say, hey, are these symptoms kind of a drug induced effect from the malaria, the anti-malaria medication, the malaria prophylaxis? So in that case, I would. However, what we received and what was coded is based on what was stated. So it didn't say they experienced abnormal thoughts due to the medication in this case. It's kind of an inferred thought here, because just because we have the information and you can kind of relate it, and of course I think that's everyone's kind of first instinct is to relate it, but in that case, to confirm that it was actually drug induced, a query should be sent, because we don't know what this patient, the rest of their background could be, right? What they actually have going on. Maybe they do have something deeper, that unrelated to the malaria prophylaxis, that just kind of, came out. So to be safe, I would send a query. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I think what you just answered kind of relates to the remaining two questions on this example, because it's someone said, inappropriate schedule of product discontinuation, and then another person raised, would this all fall under the umbrella of psychosis?
Yeah. So in that case, if because obviously you can start to infer things, and we always say do not infer. We kind of want to go by what's stated. And since it did state they took the malaria prophylaxis, but it does not state that directly caused it. It just shows that, there was a start, they took the medication, things happened, and then kind of they stopped it. They returned to a normal state, but we don't know if it was actually drug related. So I would say send a query in that case, or send a query to say, is there another psychosis or something we need to know that's going on that they may have as an underlying condition that isn't reported here, that maybe you want to get a grip on and kind of code that, and instead of all the symptoms. So you can do that as well. But based off of what we received, how to break it down, what should be coded, and then on the back end, this is something you can discuss internally in your organization and say, okay, is this something we need to look in further? And I think I mentioned that kind of when the term first came up, that it contains a lot of information. And this one's kind of a doozy where it's like not just, a headache or vomiting. It's like actual, cutting himself, feeling down, things like that. So this is something you may want to flag, look into further, have, speak to your physicians if you aren't a safety physician or a clinical physician or something like that, get more information around and kind of go into a little bit further. But from just a coding standpoint and how to break it down and what would be coded based off of what was broken down, those are the LLTs, minus the parasitic infection, because we would go to malaria prophylaxis, that would come through. So are there just one last shot at the questions, or?
Yes, we actually just have one question left, and it's about not this example, but the example before.
Okay.
They said, can we report two different events, the one related to the headache and the one related to exacerbation of asthma?
Yeah, so we definitely want to capture both, because we had an asthma related to taking an NSAID, right? And then we also had the headache. So I would say how we broke it down is we want to capture both and code both of those. So yes, in that case, I would suggest that. All right. So with that being said, we have reached the end and it's 12:29, so pretty timely here. But I put up a poll now for feedback on this session, as well as any future suggestions you may have. So if you have something that has come through and you want us to kind of go through it, or you have suggestions for kind of topics you want us to discuss in our next Let's Code Together, please feel free to put them in here. Give us feedback on, today's session. So it should be activated right now. Okay, there we go. I see response, so that's good. I always want to make sure. And while people are giving feedback, I'm just going to pull up. We do have some contacts and some information here for you, some helpful websites that we always provide, as well as, a link to the training schedule and supporting documentation. I know Samina mentioned a couple times the points to consider. So you can use these links to find that information. And finally, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining today. I hope you enjoyed the session. See, we go through things. We see LLTs. We get LLTs from you all on the line, and then see even sometimes we change our LLT that we put because you all found a better LLT that's available. So we take it all into consideration. And we do this to kind of help you with your day-to-day. So that's why it's so important to give us suggestions, because we will use them for future coding courses. And I know everyone's so busy. So again, we just want to say thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to come sit with us or join us for an hour and a half. And Samina, I don't know if you want to say anything before we sign off, but.
No, I really like all these positive feedback, so that is very encouraging. And of course, as we stated before, any challenging coding scenarios you have that you'd like us to consider for future trainings, do let us know.
Yes, and as you can see, we do go through these kind of, of course we prepare for them, but then we also adapt as we go through. If there's something that someone sees that maybe we didn't see, we'll work it in and, an LLT, or if it's a query that needs to go out or whatever the case may be. So hopefully you all enjoy it and join us for a future session. And again, thank you so much. Wish you a great rest of your Tuesday and rest of your week. And with that being said, Hannah, one last shot on questions. Any other questions, or are we good to go?
No more questions. Just some thank yous in the chat.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.